Good evening, good evening. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Bruce Scott, and I currently have the privilege and honor of serving as president and CEO of the Olmsted Foundation. I'm going to talk a little bit about George Olmsted and the foundation. I'm going to let the chairman of the board introduce our guest speaker, Admiral Richardson, but first of all, I want to make it absolutely clear, we do nothing with parks, okay? We're not Frederick Law Olmsted. We didn't create Central Park. We don't know anything about parks, okay? Period. Second thing, and this even goes for some of our applicants, there's no A in Olmsted. It's ED. I don't need to tell you, our reaction is when we see somebody, the Olmsted Scholarship, EAD, is the most important thing I've ever wanted to do, and I didn't even Google how to spell it, okay? But now this is our fifth Olmsted Lecture series. Now, why do we do it at the National Press Club? It isn't because it's cheap. No, it's not cheap. The food is great, the bar is open, but more importantly, it's right in the heart of DC. And we want national security leaders to come to learn, to hear from an expert in national security, and to learn a little bit about the Olmsted Scholar Program. As I looked at our guest speaker tonight, I was thinking, one of the things the Olmsted Scholar Program does is make young officers very uncomfortable. And it's kind of the yin and the yang. I look at our speaker tonight, I understand he has spent 11 years underwater. My God, 11 years. Our first Olmsted Scholar, our first speaker, Mike Hopkins, Olmsted Scholar, he has spent more than a year on the space station. He's an astronaut. You can't get more yin and yang than that. Our second speaker, John Abizade, General John Abizade, he spent almost 7 years in miserable weather in desert sands in the Middle East. Our next speaker, who's now on our board, Admiral Kurt Tidd, I'm told you spent 15 years afloat, Kurt, is that right? 15 years in the deep blue sea. So again, it's opposites. It is opposites, and that's the heart of this program. A little bit about General Olmsted. He graduated from West Point in 1922. He had an older brother named Gerald. Gerald went to the prep school, and Gerald went to the evil Naval Academy. Oh, the Naval Academy in 1918. I know we got a blue crowd tonight. I know, believe me. I can see, we're going to end up with anchors away, I'm positive. But anyway, he went to the Naval Academy. They both graduated in 1922. And for the only time in history, George Olmsted was the brigade commander, the first captain of the Corps Cadets, and Gerald Olmsted was the brigade commander of the Brigade of Midshipmen. It has never happened since. Kind of a fascinating little tidbit of history. Now, tragically, Gerald, a year after graduation, he was home-ported on a destroyer in New York City, got bacterial meningitis, they evacuated him off the ship, and he died a day later. So he tragically was lost so very early. But General Olmsted went on. He served on active duty 3 years and then went, and this is very important, made a lot of money, because had he served a whole career, he wouldn't have made a lot of money, and we would have charged you $25 a head to come tonight. He made a lot of money, and in World War II in Korea, he repatriated back 11,000 prisoners of war, U.S. prisoners of war in World War II from the Pacific Theater without losing one. And in Korea, he was very, very heavily involved with our allies. But what George Olmsted, a farm boy from Iowa, realized is that the U.S. military is really good tactically. They're very smart, and most of them are engineers. But they don't know anything about people and cultures. People and culture. So he said, and it's one of our mottos, an officer must be broadly educated. So out of his own largesse, out of his own account, he created the Olmsted Scholar Program some 61 years ago this year. We're picking our 61st class. He paid for it out of his money. General Olmsted decided that what he'd do is he would select from all services, and he's not taking foreign area officers. He wanted line officers. He selects them. We then send the scholar and the spouse to 1 year of language training. And then we give them enough language so they don't starve when they get in the country. We send them to the country. We make them apply and get, and General Olmsted specifically said to all these engineers, nuke engineers, aerospace, civil, you've got to enroll in a graduate program in liberal arts. Talk about taking these guys and gals out of their comfort zone. He did that. We send them away. We send the spouse to language training. The kids get enrolled in local schools. And the whole objective was, after 2 years, total language fluency, immersion in a culture, enrollment in graduate school, and when you're done, you go back and drive submarines, you command SEAL teams, you fly F-22s, you command Ranger battalions, you go back and be a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, and just as of 2 years ago, a Coast Guardsman. The purpose of that was that that experience would allow you to be a better officer. I'm often asked, we've sent 672 officers to 218 universities in 63 countries and in 41 languages. 41 languages. I'm reminded of the Greek scholar, soldier, warrior Thucydides, who said, a society that separates its scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. The Olmsted Scholar Program is the antithesis of that. I'm often asked, how do you know where to send them? Well, they give us a list of 10. And a little anecdote, John Abizade and I were at West Point together. John got the scholarship a year ahead of me. John, when the names came out and the location, John was going to Amman, Jordan, okay? This was 1978. We had 250,000 red-blooded American soldiers keeping the Russian hordes out of Germany, okay? And John's going to Amman, Jordan. I called John on the phone and said, John, are you simply crazy? He said, what do you mean? I said, you could go anywhere you want. You're going to Amman, Jordan. The U.S. Army's never going to fight a war in the Middle East. That may be one reason he retired where he did and I retired as a 2-star. I'm not positive, but I think so. So that is the purpose of the program. What I would like afterwards, when the heavy poo-poos come out and the bar's still open, I'd like each of you who's not a scholar to introduce yourself to one of our scholars and just ask them about the program. I'd like the scholars just to stand up. They've got black name tags on, so look around, and please, if you're not a scholar, seek them out. We got a lot of scholars because they heard it was free food and drink, okay? So that's what the program is. The final thing I'll say before I turn it over to our chairman is that a Marine came to me after a year in country. Young Marine, interestingly, he was a Cobra pilot. He then worked with the Army at Fort Bragg, became a Little Bird pilot. Remarkable record in combat. And last year, he was the only Marine captain in the Marine Corps to be selected early for promotion to major. And he came to me, he said, you know, everyone is telling us for the next iteration of warfare, you've got to think outside the box. The Olmsted Scholar Program is the only program that takes you outside of that box and simply tells you to think. So that's the purpose of our program. I'm honored now to introduce our chairman of the board, to introduce our guest speaker, Admiral William Doug Crowder. Doug?
Thanks, Bruce. Appreciate it. Good evening. Welcome to all of you. It's a great honor to have you here with us tonight as we welcome the 31st Chief of Naval Operations as our guest speaker tonight. Now, before that, I'd like to introduce our board of directors. When I call your name, directors, if you recognize it, please stand. Bruce Scott. Bruce Scott, Major General Bruce Scott, you've met, obviously. So Olmsted Scholar, class of 1979 in Freiburg, Germany. Pat Donahue, Lieutenant General Pat Donahue, United States Army, retired. Olmsted Scholar, class of 1987, in Innsbruck, Austria, a hardship tour. Kurt Tidd, where's Kurt? Kurt Tidd, back here. Admiral Kurt Tidd recently retired as the commander of U.S. Southern Command, was an Olmsted Scholar, class of 1984 in Bordeaux, France. Torkel Patterson. Torkel Patterson is a retired naval officer, former president of Raytheon Asia, Olmsted Scholar class of 1981 in Japan. Kathy Gautier, Kathy in the back. Colonel Kathy Gautier, United States Air Force, was an Olmsted Scholar, class of 1988, wait for it, Caracas, Venezuela. Have you gotten any phone calls lately from anyone? I would have called you. Bob McClure, Colonel Bob McClure, United States Army retired, former CEO of the West Point Association of Graduates, Olmsted Scholar class of 1983 in Mainz, Germany. The board also has one active duty director from 4 of the 5 services that are part of our program. Steve Wolf, Steve in the back, Colonel Steve Wolf, United States Marine Corps, 1999 Olmsted Scholar in Berlin, Germany. Paul Sostak, is Paul, I didn't say that. Paul Sostak, Colonel, United States Air Force, Olmsted Scholar class of 2002, Seville, Spain. Alan Pepper, Colonel Alan Pepper, United States Army, Olmsted Scholar class of 2003 in Strasbourg, France. Dave Sauvé, Captain Dave Sauvé, United States Navy, Olmsted Scholar class of 2001, Santiago, Chile. And second to last, as a board member, Chris Howard, Dr. Chris Howard. Chris is not an Olmsted Scholar. He's merely a Rhodes Scholar, an Air Force Academy grad, a Lieutenant Colonel combat veteran in the Air Force, selected as first team All-American, All-Academic. He's the president, currently president of the Robert Morris University in the Pittsburgh area. And last but not least is yours truly, an Olmsted Scholar class of 1980 in Lausanne, Switzerland, where I studied European political affairs and advanced yodeling. Unfortunately, I have a chest cold, so I won't be able to perform tonight. Thank you, directors. Well, let me just start by saying our guest speaker tonight needs no introduction. We all know him well. So I thought I'd tell a sea story instead, so you know. I can see my non-Navy types are rolling their eyes. For those who are not in the Navy, the definition of a sea story is a humorous tale in which there is at least a thread of truth. Do I have that about right, Stino? Yeah, okay. So here's mine. So a couple years ago, I'm sitting at home on a Tuesday evening with my wife, Susan, when the house phone rang. Now, or landline. For you younger Olmsted Scholars, I'll explain what a landline is later. Well, we never get a call from anyone we want to take on the house phone. It's someone selling us something or that sort of thing. And I rarely even look up in my Wall Street Journal when the house phone rings. But something told me on about the 3rd ring, I looked up, and we have caller ID on the TV, and I saw a number displayed, and I said, holy smokes. Actually, I didn't say smokes. It was a phone number that was marked indelibly in my mind, 703-695-5664. I turned to Susan and said, I have to take this call. It's C&O's office. Now, understand at this time, I've been retired for 7 years, okay? Susan said, as I was running to the house phone, how do you know it's the C&O's office? I said, I don't have time, I don't have time. I picked it up on the 6th ring. Now, what many of the audience may not know is that I've served 7 tours on the CNO staff. Not bragging, looking for sympathy, actually, including 4 as a flag officer. Now that's 10 years, 9 months, 12 days, 17 and a half hours, approximately. I'd received hundreds of calls on 703-695-5664. And a number of them were one-way conversations in which I was in the receive-only mode. So my body kind of went into a long dormant muscle memory, and including what I thought was a long depressed facial twitch. And I answered, Admiral Crowder, sir. A delightful young petty officer in your office said, are you available to speak with the CNO? And I said, why, certainly. And she said, 1 moment, please. While waiting, I tried to guess why I was being called at home on a Tuesday night by the Chief of Naval Operations. Did they find that 1979 report that Lieutenant Crowder had left his safe open? Those are the kind of thoughts that were going through my mind. So Admiral Richardson came on the line. He was delightful, non-accusatory, and said, just wanted to call to apologize. I go, wow, I didn't see that coming. He says, I had signed up to go to the Olmsted Lecture that year, and something's come up, and I've got a meeting that, that was unscheduled, and I just want to call you personally and tell you I was unable to come. And I said, well, I greatly appreciate your call. Yeah, right. And before signing off, he offered, if sometime in the future you would like me to come and be your Olmsted Lecture speaker, I'd be happy to do that. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope I have demonstrated to you that I have enough memory to know that 703-695-5664 is the CNO's number, and that the CNO did offer to come. So Bruce and I use the same line frequently. Actually, it's my line. Normally, I steal other people's line. Right? Is that right, Pete Daly? Yeah, okay. But so, I wanted to make sure, on the off chance you'd seen a recent AFCEA leadership video. They do a leadership series. They asked me to come and be interviewed. And when I do an interview, I thought it was, one part of it was taken out of context, okay? When I get asked to do interviews, I always say, I'll do that on one condition, that the first question is, tell me about the Olmsted Scholar Program. So sure enough, the interviewer said, tell me about the Olmsted Scholar Program is the first question. And I use the same line that Bruce used the same line that I always use. That is not just an educational program, it's a leadership program. Because we do take these young scholars and we give them just enough language training that they won't starve, but not enough that they'll be comfortable. And then we parachute them into the country that they're going to, no support. They have to figure it out themselves. So I finished the interview, went home. 2 days later, a young lady called me and said, hi, I'm the video editor for this interview you did last week. And before we put it up on our website, I have a couple questions. Sure. You said you give them just enough language training they won't starve, but how much is that? How much language training is that? And I said, well, it depends on the language. If it's Spanish or French or German, probably about 6 months. If it's Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, probably about a year. She says, okay, one more question. How long is the parachute training? So, we buy your young officers airline tickets, and we buy their family airline tickets. I'm just kidding about the parachute. Anyhow, so let me just say that our speaker, the 31st Chief of Naval Operations, grew up in the submarine Navy, commanded at every level, including the entire Navy's submarine force. He was the naval aide to the President of the United States. before becoming the CNO in 2000 and whenever it was, yeah, 15. In 15, he was the director of the Navy Nuclear Power Program. And one thing about his bio that struck me and strikes most of us who have commanded at sea, Admiral Richardson won the James Stockdale Leadership Award. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is an award that you can't compete for. Only your peers, those others who are in command at the same time, can put you in for it. And then, so this is the very best of our 05 commanders out there, picking the very best among them to win the James Stockdale Award. So with that, CNO, thank you so much for coming today. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Very kind. So, 11 years underwater, right? I'm not an Olmsted Scholar, as you know, and I'm not a Rhodes Scholar. So, in fact, I'm probably not really even considered a scholar. And you know, 11 years underwater, probably for anybody, particularly in the business world, is enough to disqualify you from doing anything. Gotta be kidding me. And so, anyway, I think it's a legitimate question to ask, you know, what the heck am I here for, right? And I'm really only here for a couple of reasons. And the primary is to, I guess, pay tribute to Doug Crowder. And he's finishing up a long time involvement with the Olmsted Foundation and 6 years as chairman. And I just can't really think of a better ambassador for the Olmsted Foundation than you, Doug. And I want to just take a moment to just kind of embrace that and let us all think about that together. You've really had kind of an earth-shattering tenure as the president here, and I think there's about 670 scholarships awarded during your tenure, which is quite a milestone. But if you think about the influence that is going to be felt by the entire, certainly, as you said, you breed leaders, and those leaders go on to lead. And so not only in the military, but what they do beyond the military, you know, your thumbprint is on all of that. And the fact that you would say, hey, listen, I'll be happy to come and talk to your organization, do your interview, but the very first thing you have to ask me is about the Olmsted scholarship. I think that speaks volumes about what a great ambassador you've been. And you've also been very forward-thinking, really moving the Olmsted Scholarship into the future, recognizing that, boy, I'll tell you, if there's one thing about our current environment, it's that it's changing very rapidly. And that you were right there recognizing that the scholarship, Olmsted, must change with it. And so just like you highlighted that you brought the Coast Guard into the fold and so many other things, you've really kind of helped the scholarship keep pace with this rapidly changing environment into which those leaders will go. And that I think also as an ambassador, mentor, sensei, you were very keen on highlighting that this is a community, these Olmsted Scholars, and that this community should stay connected, that there's strength in those connections, intellectual strength, but also I would say that sense of community, that almost emotional resilience that comes up as all these leaders go on and get tested in ways that I think you only know if you're one of those leaders. And sometimes you really do kind of need to phone a friend who might have been down that very sparse path before you or with you and can reach out. I've also been very keen to recognize that it's a very diverse scholarship and there's no way that one formula can fit all. And so you've been, I would say, flexible in terms of working with each of the services to make sure that once we identify the best people, we'll figure out a way to get them on the Olmsted bus, right? We're not going to let be too rigid and miss a great opportunity. Particularly in in the Navy, naval aviation can tend to be a kind of a rigid pipeline, right? And so, you know, there's that golden path, and you get off that golden path at your peril. We're changing that, thanks to your influence and others. And you worked with us in terms of making sure that everybody got a chance to take advantage of this amazing program. And so to all of the leaders in this room, again, just thank you for having me. You talk about being nervous. Try giving a talk to you guys. It's pretty, you get graded as you go. But I'll tell you, the results speak for themselves. Just look around the room, right? We get better decision makers, all of that cultural training. It teaches us to think on our feet, doesn't it, right? And we just have to kind of make do with the tools that we have and somehow make it work. Certainly the epitome of scholarship, but we also become scholar, leader, diplomats by virtue of the experience in the Olmsted. So why don't we give a nice round of applause to Admiral. So that was really my talk. I just that's about it. Yeah. Actually, it does intersect with my talk a little bit, and so what I'd hope to do is maybe spin through a couple of charts, lay out some high-level thinking, and then quickly go to the Q&A or the conversation that we'll have together, because I always found that is so much more interesting. Before I do, though, I just have to say, Kurt, would you stand up again? This guy, how long has it been since you retired, Kurt?
1 January.
1 January. He's lost 10 years. He looks 10 years younger than he did on active duty. Kurt, thank you so much for your service. And, I didn't know you could tan, but you can. I mean,
There's 7 years on the joint staff. Took away all of the tanning.
Yeah, all of that goes out of your skin down there in the NMCC, right? Okay. All right, well, let's get going here. We'll have a fun time, I hope. We start a lot of our talks with this, okay? And I like this quote. If you're a Navy person, you can't do much better than this quote, to be honest. And one of the nice things that about this quote is that it was said by George Washington. And we're finding, as leaders, that when we start to talk about our business, whether that's to an internal audience with our sailors, or whether that's an external audience like this one, or communities, or whoever, that it's not a bad thing to just stop and dwell on some of the foundational principles upon which our nation was founded. And that particularly in this audience, don't have to tell you about this idea of America and what it means in the world. And particularly right now, when there's a lot of noise in the system, there's a lot of winds blowing. We in the Navy like to just, and in the services, I think, all of them, like to steady up on this course for a little while and talk about what America means. What is the value proposition of the United States in the world today? The foundational ideas. We're quoting a lot from those documents like the Declaration of Independence, like common sense, like the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, speeches, by great leaders throughout our history that resonate on that theme of what America means, because it's just so important that we don't go by this. There's a really great article in Foreign Affairs, just the last edition, that talked about the fact that as a nation we really don't have thousands of years of cultural momentum to define us, that stitches us together by virtue of our history. We're kind of a pickup team in history in the United States. And what binds us together is our story and our values. And we've got to come back and revisit that narrative as often as we can and look for opportunities to strengthen it, to strengthen that story among our people so that we don't kind of lose sight of who we are and what we mean. And it's particularly important for, we think, for the military and I would say first among equals, the Navy, because it's not uncommon that the first person that you come in, the first physical manifestation of this idea might be a sailor or a soldier or an airman or a Marine or a Coast Guardsman who's out and about doing the business of our Defense Department and confronting and meeting people. And so it's important, we think, to just make sure that everybody understands the responsibilities that come with that, that you are on contact, a diplomat by virtue of representing our nation, and so you should have an idea of what our nation means. And so this idea of honorable and glorious is an important one that maybe I'll circle back to at the end. But today we're going to talk a little bit about, and we probably spend a lot of our, the vast majority of our time talking about what it means to be a decisive naval force, okay? And so as we think about that, it's a great time for us to come together and have this conversation because following the National Defense Strategy, which was issued about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago now, and really got us focused on this idea of great power competition. Our Navy strategist, Stuart Munch here, kind of leading that team, got together and we started thinking about, okay, what does this mean for our strategy? What does this mean for Navy strategy? And we've done a lot of thinking, and that all kind of wrapped up at the end of last year, first part of this year, calendar year. And so this is a good time to kind of try all these ideas with you, and so I look forward to just sharing some of our thinking. All right? And we think about if you're going to be decisive, decisive where, right? What does it mean to be decisive? What is the environment in which you have to be decisive? And so we describe the environment sort of like this. And we'll work from the top of the slide down. One, we talk about it now in terms of a spectrum of competition, a spectrum of rivalry, however you want to think about it. But it seems that some of the traditional approaches to this competition, where we think about this linear phasing, right? Phase 0, phase 1, it's becoming less and less relevant today as our competitors are moving with great agility up and down that spectrum with speed and surprising us in ways that we just have to get our minds around. And so the first part is think about this as a continuous spectrum. And it's also not only continuous, but we're competing in ways that are kind of nonlinear, right? And so particularly as you think about, well, let's think about the last time we were in a great power competition. This domain, information domain, cyber domain, all of that didn't even exist, right? And now we can't do anything without it, right? It's one of our major strengths and one of our major vulnerabilities at the same time, right? It defines and speeds up so much of what we do that, this is, so not only the competitors have changed, but the rules of the game themselves have changed. And so things like space and cyber are brand new, and they span the entire spectrum, right? And so you could be operating in different points of this spectrum in this competition at the same time, right? And some of our competitors can escalate very quickly to a higher point on that spectrum, reestablish a new normal, and then go back to day-to-day operations. And if we're not ready to respond or anticipate really with that level of agility and effectiveness, we're just going to be behind, right? And so, I like sports analogies, football analogy, just in recognition of the front row here. We could have player by player, the best person in that position in the entire league, right? We could, so position by position, the best at that position in the league. But if that defense is not rehearsed and practiced and trained to go against the no-huddle offense, right? They're going to get behind with every play, and more behind, and more behind. And they'll be caught with too many people on the field, and they'll be penalized until the offense will walk into the end zone almost untouched, all right? And so there's this idea of speed and agility that's central. As we look at this spectrum, we think that kind of in the lower end is primarily a challenge of our imaginations. This is not generally going to challenge us from a technology standpoint. It's not generally going to challenge us from a resourcing standpoint. This is going to challenge us intellectually. So it comes right back front and center to the very problem that the Olmsted Scholarship strives to solve. How do we become better thinkers, right? More agile thinkers. And so, in fact, you know, if you consider this part of this spectrum, we really don't even know what to call it, right? And so you've probably heard terms like gray zone or gray war. Not super imaginative. There's this phrase out of the National Defense Strategy. Stuart, you have to check me. It's such a mouthful. This competition below the level of traditional conflict. Okay. Try saying that 5 times fast. Okay. And again, it doesn't give you a whole lot to go on in terms of characterizing what this is, right? What is this challenge that faces us? And so you can see, you know, a conceptual challenge for sure. At the high end, always a capability challenge. And this is another, well, I think a matter of agility. And so we want to make sure that we're going to remain superior at the high end of that spectrum, right? So that we can not get outfought by virtue of material out there, okay? And so our response to this really is in 3 general areas, one of which is to get after and restore some of that agility that we talked about. I talked about this conceptual agility as being one of sort of 3 agilities that we're after. And this conceptual agility, we've got not only kind of at the strategic level, but at the operational level. We're moving naval forces around the globe in places we haven't been in a long time, right? So there's that operational concepts agility, distributed maritime operations, where this fleet operates in a sort of a physically decentralized manner, but the ability to concentrate effects or fires in a concentrated or a centralized place. And so there's conceptual agility, and we have a lot of concepts. You know, I talked about the Navy strategy, the operational design, and there's a whole host of derivative or subordinate concepts. Related to that, there's geographic stability. And so in this war in the Middle East, as you alluded to, General, we got very, very good as a Navy of leaving the continental United States with force elements, nominally a carrier strike group, going to the Gulf, staying there as long as we could, and then coming back to home port. And we call it the Optimized Fleet Response Plan, was the system that generated that. And we optimized against cost, right? So we did that mission for the lowest possible cost. And we leaned out a lot. And so now, as we get back into moving force elements around the globe in places we haven't been to, we're finding that we have to optimize against a different set of criteria. We have to optimize around flexibility. We have to optimize around maybe unpredictability. And so this is not going to be as low cost as just going to do one thing and coming back. Something that we found with the latest strike group deployment. So the Harry S. Truman strike group went out, and we ran that strike group around the globe in places we haven't been in a long time. We kind of ran it through the Straits of Gibraltar, into the Mediterranean, just like we always did, normally go through the Suez, except we pulled it up short. And we stopped in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we did some tremendous work fighting ISIS from the Eastern Med. You can do strikes into Syria, strikes into Iraq from that part of the world. And but we also did tremendously high work with some of the NATO allies. So we got a chance to do some really great high-end maritime training with Italy, France, England, others. We got to use ranges that we hadn't used in a long time, ranges in Europe and Morocco. And so overall, the readiness of the strike group remained higher because they were able to do so much more challenging things with higher level partners doing missions that just kept their overall readiness higher. Then after they were done doing that, we brought them back home, right? We did a mid-deployment port call in Norfolk, Virginia, and it was very productive. We did some terrific maintenance there. We kind of kept the operational posture, right? And which was good because we didn't tell anybody we were doing this. So when the team left, they thought, okay, I'm going to be gone for 7 months. So that means I'm going to clean out of my apartment. I'm going to park my car in long-term storage, da-da-da-da-da. And now I'm back at the 3-month point, right? And I got no place to live, and I got no car. Well, that's kind of the way it would be if you were overseas anyway, right? So here's how we're going to get along, just like it's we got some great maintenance and training done, and then we got back underway. This time, we started to go east again, just like we were headed for the Gibraltar Straits, except we sort of turned everything off and turned left and went north. And we went up north of the Arctic Circle with the strike group for the first time since 1991, okay? It's been a long time since we've been back up there. We had to open some old books to figure out how to do business there, and it's a good thing we still had those around, right? We relearned a lot of lessons. While much has changed since 1991, one thing that has not is it's still really cold as hell up there in November, all right? And those of you who have been underway in the North Atlantic in November know that the seas can get very, very challenging, right? You know? And so all of these skills we had to sort of relearn all the way down to the tactical level, the shipboard level. So we're getting all this back, right? Nothing was natural, right, as we poked up there for the first time. And so it took kind of fleet commander intervention to get the mail to the ship because we hadn't sent mail up that direction in a long time. I was privileged to spend Thanksgiving with the strike group. So we flew on out there. And I'll tell you what, if you wanted, I mean, as stealthy as we were trying to be, if you really wanted to know where the Harry S. Truman was going to be in late November, you just had to follow this 4,000 pounds of turkeys around the world, right? And at some point, that 4,000 pounds of turkey was going to intersect with the Truman, and we were going to have Thanksgiving dinner. And you know, a lot of that logistic stuff is a little bit too out in the open, and so we need to figure out how to do that with some sense of security. So lots of lessons learned. Don't forget your baseball bats when you go up there. Admiral Crowder, you know, there's nothing like knocking the ice off the wings or the superstructure, whatever it may be, like a Louisville Slugger. And so this is something we read in the books. And so we had a whole bunch of bats up there knocking ice off of stuff. So there's this idea of geographic stability, flexibility, agility that we have to restore. And then finally, this technological agility. And this, I think, is a strategic Achilles heel that we've got to overcome, right? And so I know I'm speaking to a very, very, very intellectual crowd here. And so I'm confident that we've got a few chess players in the room. Is that right? I mean, any grandmasters? It wouldn't surprise me at all. But anyway, I kind of know how the pieces move, you know, and if I was going to play chess against Garry Kasparov and I played 1,000 games, it would be 1,000-0 Kasparov, right? I would not win one single game. And I'll tell you what, you know, if Garry Kasparov took his bishops and knights off the table, right, off the board, and we played again, 1,000 games, it would still be 1,000-0 Kasparov. But if I got him to take his rooks off the board and maybe half the pawns, I'd probably have to get that queen off too. Eventually, Richardson beats Kasparov, right? Because material matters at the end of the day, right? And if the discrepancy becomes too big, no matter how much better the other player is, just material will overcome that, right? There's only so much you can do. So it would still take me 57 moves to checkmate him, but I would finally get there, right? He'd probably offer me a draw a few times, but it would happen. And so when we talk about, hey, it's going to be okay, CNO, because our pilots are trained so much better than theirs, that's a margin that's too close for me, right? That's not the way we do things. We make sure that our worst pilots can beat their best pilots because we put them in much better equipment, right? And the ability to get that equipment through its development process and out into the fleet, into the hands of our aviators, into the hands of our sailors, that's a strategic imperative, a problem we must solve. We must solve that problem, or material will start to matter against us. The other so those are the three agilities. The other big idea is that this is going to be a long competition. It's going to be a rivalry that lasts decades. And so we've got to think in sustainable terms. If you're a game theorist, you got to be thinking in terms of infinite games, right? This is not a clock that's going to count down in the fourth quarter to 0 and we'll declare a winner. We've got to be thinking in terms of very sustainable, infinite types of approaches, which means that we have to figure out how to keep score, right? We're not in this for just the theoretical competition, the thrill of competition. We're in this to win it. And so we have to know that we're winning it over these long terms. And so there's this idea of sustainability. And then related to this challenge at the high end, related to our ability to get material out with agility, we want to be able to de-escalate to the left, to go more towards day-to-day, less violent competition, but we have to do so on our terms, right? We want to de-escalate, but de-escalate on our terms, in the terms of our allies and partners, and not on our competitors' terms. And so these are kind of the three main themes that runs through. This is sort of how the approach, our solution is organized. 4 lines of effort, we kind of used, we colored them, right? Because we didn't want to get into discussions about priorities, what's the most important. They're all important, they're all equally important. And so we've got one that talks about operations and warfighting, right? Which, that's pretty dang important. We've got this gold line of effort which talks about how we bring in people into the Navy, train them, educate them, assign them, retain them. And so that's a very important line of effort. This expanding and strengthening our network of partners, as we think about the Navy as being really just one node in many, many networks, right? And so, one network is just the joint force, right? So we are all here with our sister services, and we help to make up the joint force. We might want to think of a little bit bigger network in terms of the interagency, right? And so not only defense, but the rest of the government. Academia, industry, right? All of these networks, we've got to consider them as part of our partners. And certainly our allies and partners in the international community, we're just one node. And if we recognize that, we'll be that much more effective as a Navy. The Olmsted Scholarship, I think, center of gravity, right, in that purple line of effort in many ways. And then there's this green line of effort which talks about achieving high velocity outcomes. It goes to this idea, 2 ideas. One is this high velocity. This is the second version of this design for maintaining maritime superiority. In the first version, we talked about high velocity learning. And there's still a strong theme of learning throughout our operational approach. And we can talk about that, but we just simply have to learn faster than our competition, okay? And we get at that in a number of different ways. And then this idea of high velocity, there is a sense of urgency that confronts us. And we've got to kind of get out of what I would call a too complacent approach to this challenge and get after it with some alacrity, with some butterflies in our stomach. If we are not approaching this with some butterflies in our stomach right now, I don't think we're fully understanding the stakes at play, okay? So, and then it's very important to understand that all 4 of these lines of effort, they rest on a foundation of our value proposition as a Navy, all right? And so we take very seriously our core values of honor, courage, and commitment. And we have these core attributes of integrity, accountability, initiative, and toughness as sort of a litmus test to grade our homework, to grade our decisions, to assess our behavior so that we do our very best not to have a say-do mismatch in terms of our values. And I just want to dwell a little bit on the people business because it's so central to everything. Knock on wood, we have met our recruiting goals for 145 months straight, right? 12 years and 1 month, okay? And if you think about what that means, the economy's been up and down during that time. It's kind of up right now, which is generally, that's the canary in the coal mine for recruiting. It makes things very challenging. And we continue to meet this. And, you know, I can't compete on salary, right? I just simply cannot pay. This is the most, by every measure of performance, it's the most talented Navy we've ever had, right? I mean, test scores, very, very high. Athletic scores, high. They're super handsome and beautiful. They're just charming to be around in general. By every measure, this is a very, very talented Navy, okay? And so you have to wonder. They could write their check anywhere in the world. They could go anywhere. And you know, we talk about competition, the spectrum of the competition for that talent is as intense as any competition I'm in right now. And yet, we seem to be hitting the mark month after month. Not taking any of that for granted. Oh, by the way, for that lower salary, you get the bonus of going to sea for 7 or 8 months a year, you know, separated from your family. And so I think it has something to do with this value proposition that we've got as a service. And I find that our young people are eager to be part of something that's bigger than themselves, something noble, something that really kind of represents not only being definitive and decisive, but also honorable and glorious. And if you think about the Navy, certainly we've talked quickly about the Navy's contribution to the military dimension of national power, right? And why we have a Navy. But this audience certainly can remember that there are several very important treaties signed on U.S. Navy ships in our nation's history. There are tremendous amount of conferences held on Navy ships, right? When you were doing your Olmsted time overseas, if a U.S. Navy warship pulled into a port in the country where you were stationed, it's almost common that the U.S. ambassador to that nation will host a reception on sovereign U.S. territory, that ship, right? And so there is a deep contribution of the Navy to the diplomatic element of national power as well as military. And then finally, back in George Washington's day or so, the Navy was born to go overseas at the Straits of Gibraltar and defend our trade against the Barbary pirates. And you know what? That's what we're still doing. Not against the Barbary pirates, but we're out and about in the world, right? So the South China Sea, a very highly visible body of water, in the media a lot. Why are we there? Well, we've been there steadily for 70 years, and we're not going anywhere, right? We're not going anywhere. We're going to continue to be there because the global economy is about, 90% of our goods are traded by sea. 2/3 of the American economy is directly connected to the sea. We are a maritime nation. It's extremely important that those sea lines remain open. South China Sea, 1/3 of the world's trade flows through the South China Sea, right? We can't give up on that. Our prosperity is directly tied to that, okay? So we're going to be there, guaranteeing that freedom of navigation. And so you start to see the Navy's connection to the economic dimension of national power as well. And so it really does kind of go back to the founding principles of the nation and the fundamental elements of national power. And the Navy is there in each one of those, okay? And so that's why we take that part seriously. Here's kind of the job statement of the CNO. All right? This goes back to Thomas Paine, okay? That at the end of the day, the Navy, when built, should be worth more than it cost. Mic drop, right? That's really about it. This comes from Common Sense, right? That pamphlet that Thomas Paine wrote. And if you read Common Sense, it's got a lot of Navy in it, I mean, it's like a commercial for the Navy. And so, so again, this idea that the Navy and the nation are fundamentally intertwined from our DNA is a really important aspect of what we do. And so I appreciate you letting me talk through a little bit about what we do tonight, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Good evening, Admiral. I'm Commander Audrey Adams from Fleet Cyber Command. I heard recently that the Navy had hired some experts in psychology to work on debiasing our decision-making. This is right in line with the Olmsted ethos of challenging your assumptions of reality.
Right.
And I find it very gratifying that this is an initiative that you've undertaken. Can you talk about the challenges that you've had countering our established culture and some wins that you've experienced so far?
I'll tell you what, I'm glad you brought that up because it's an exciting program. We're working with, well, primarily Dr. Jennifer Lerner, who's up at the Kennedy School, the Belfer Center there. And she's a behavior science, decision scientist, I think is the way she'd like to be described. And she's absolutely world class and very, very committed to making the Navy and the military in general better decision makers. And you know, we've learned a tremendous amount about decision science in the last 15, 20 years. It's really been an exciting part of cognitive science. The other part about this goes to, I think, a characteristic of the competition that we're going to face going forward. And so, yeah, I kind of grew up in a pretty technical community. My early degrees were technical degrees, and you kind of get, you know, ahead, or some, you know, some of your the competitive space was based on how quickly you could recall data, how quickly you can manipulate equations, solve for problems, you know, mathematical problems. That playing field is all going to be very level as we move to very highly, you know, high performance computing. And that playing field is going to be more level across the world than we like. So where's the competitive edge? The competitive edge is in how the human element can team with that technology. And the sort of unique contributions of the human part of that team are things like creativity, things like pattern recognition, innovation, and this leads you to the importance of things like diversity, having that team that is going to give you the best, most fulsome answer with the fewest blind spots and the most creativity. And so this is what this effort is all about. I'll tell you what, it's a challenge, I think, for all of us, particularly an institution like the Navy, which has almost 244 years of history now. We're kind of capital intensive. We've got things that we build that last for a while. We're, you know, right along with our tradition is our sense of values. And so there are things that are, you know, sort of fixed in our culture, and those things can be a great strength for us, right? But then there's this other part of the environment and the Navy that's moving at breakneck speed, almost a speed that can rend the institution apart if we don't manage this sort of difference in these two environments, right? And so the challenge is always, how do you get the best out of the traditions of the Navy without becoming stodgy, locked in the past, stuck in the La Brea tar pit, and disrupted by this high velocity. And so that's kind of our big challenge. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good evening, sir. Army Lieutenant Colonel Jen Hinkle. I'm currently on the G3 staff at Headquarters DA. We hear every day about what the Army modernization priorities are, but I want to know, what are the Navy modernization priorities? And in particular, how are you rearming, and restructuring the naval force, in particular for information warfare, cyber and electronic warfare?
Yeah. Well, I'll answer the second part of your question first, because after that you'll get tired of hearing me talk. I think that the first thing you have to do is to do your very best to recognize the problem that you're trying to solve. And so I would say that even 3 years ago, if you looked at the traditional domains at which the Navy was organized, we're kind of, our communities, our warfighting communities were organized roughly along those domains, right? So I was an undersea guy, a submarine guy. We have naval aviation, which is above the sea, and we have the surface warfare community on the sea, okay? And there are other communities. Jeremy comes from the special warfare community, and so there are other ones, but in general, you know, we kind of were defined along those domains. There's now a fourth pillar, which is the information warfare domain. And we have they are structured exactly like those other major warfighting pillars in terms of they have a 3-star head of the community. They have their man, train, and equip responsibilities. We have the 10th Fleet, which is our cyber force, which is our operational arm in that business. And so, you know, so we're organized for that. You know, part of those people that we're bringing into the Navy, we've got to train them up to be effective warriors in this cyber domain or this information domain, space. And we do. So we train a lot of those ourselves, and you know, surprisingly, a lot of them stick around because it's, if you want to do that sort of work, this is a very exciting place to do it, and we give you a lot of responsibility and let you do it. You also have to do kind of the material and standards part, right? So as we build new systems, they've got to be mindful of cybersecurity, you know, in their DNA. And then we've got to figure out for all that stuff that we built before, you know, how do we make that as secure as possible? And so this gets into, you know, system design, the technical warrant holders for all of those different systems that we build. And so we've got to have the standards, build to those standards, enforce those standards. And then, you know, to the point here, there's a cultural shift that has to happen, right? And so I would say that we're sort of in transition in terms of getting the cultural shift done and to become fully effective in this kind of modern way of doing warfare. So, but I'll tell you, sort of one of our very important force elements is the carrier strike group, and we have kind of a combined warfare approach to that, where you know the strike group commander's staff has these different warfare commanders, and of late in the last couple of years, the first person to talk when they go off and start to think about an operation is the information warfare commander, and they're going to set the conditions in cyber and in space and jamming and deception and stealth and all of that to lay the conditions, to establish the conditions for a successful kinetic operation. And then the kinetic folks are going to do what they do, and then the last person is going to be the information warfare commander again, who's going to kind of clean up the information battle space and make this whole thing kind of disappear. And so it's a new and exciting part of the way we're doing business. Having said that, you talk about butterflies in your stomach. This part of our business, I don't think any of us can be satisfied or complacent because it's moved so fast. Okay. One more.
Cino, thanks very much. Bill Parmentier, retired Navy. It's my pleasure to serve on your staff for 2 years before I retired. My question dovetails very much with these two. You talked about decisive naval force, and we're talking about changing paradigms. Like so many officers in my time, the paradigm was when there was a conflict, where's the nearest carrier? And I think the recent news is the Harry S. Truman's not going to go through retrofitting. We're going to kind of reduce the number of carriers. I wonder in the foreign policy decision-making, how much, in that community, how much pressure or how much pushback you had to kind of getting away from carriers and trying to get the idea that perhaps that we have other things to do with our funds.
Well, let's just look at sort of I think what you're talking about is the recent budget submission. And I would say that the message of that budget submission is that, one, it does address the fundamental problem of great power competition, okay? Two, it is moving into the future, okay? And, but three, part of that includes 2 new carriers. And so And we're not saying that the carrier is a vestige of the past, right? We're buying 2 new ones, 2 Ford-class carriers. By virtue of buying them 2 at a time, we're saving a lot of money, right? Because of the confidence that's injected with that signal allows everybody to manage risk at a lot lower level. And so risk translates into saving. Lower risk translates into lower price, and you garner those savings. $4 billion over 2 ships savings by virtue of buying them together. The kind of implicit in that decision is that the carrier remains a viable, survivable, lethal part of our future force. Okay? There's a lot of folks out there that say, hey, it's over. The carrier's not survivable. That is not how we see it. Now, you mentioned the Truman, the overhaul. As a signal for how seriously we are taking this move into the future, that is on the table. Okay? As well, in parallel to everything else we're doing, and in recognition of how fast the security environment is changing, how fast the technology environment is changing, we're doing a lot of analysis this year, right? So the current requirement for aircraft carriers for us to meet our responsibilities as a Navy is 12, okay? We're taking a look at that number in light of, we're doing a force structure assessment, which is really a meta-study of a number of different approaches to naval power, understanding naval power. And in parallel with that, the combatant commanders and the Joint Staff are doing their global campaign plans as well. And so as we learn from these studies, we're in a very responsive place, particularly with respect to Truman, that if it becomes a conclusion of those studies that we need to recover that, we're in a position to respond to that with some great agility. And so I think that the higher messages of our budget are important to keep in mind here as we move forward to execution. Don't draw wrong conclusions about us moving away or from carriers. In fact, if you think about it, the aircraft carrier is really just a truck, right? And you need to flip the narrative a little bit in that theater, which is a changing theater with respect, all of our theaters are changing with respect to long-range precision weapons. The aircraft carrier can accurately be thought of as the most survivable airfield in that theater, right? It is the only airfield that can move 720 miles a day, okay? And so it creates an incredible challenge if you want to try and target and hit that airfield. And so, let's think of it that way before we start to talk about, a future without aircraft carriers.
Well, Sino, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen. Sino, on our 60th anniversary last June, we put together a register of all our scholars. And this book has the entire story of the Olmsted Scholar Program and General Olmsted. And it has a short bio on all 672 Olmsted Scholars, including that first Navy Olmsted Scholar, Lieutenant Carl Trost. I lost track of him after that. Yeah. So this might find its place on your coffee table in your office, and you get some young junior officer comes in that really impresses you. Yeah. It really impresses you, and then maybe a little bit of a smart ass. Have him take this home for the weekend, okay? And thank you so much, sir.